Welcome to the Your Pennsylvania Ancestors podcast. This is Denise Allen. On this week's episode of the podcast, we go back to Philadelphia to learn about the special archival collections in and around the city of Philadelphia. First, I'm going to start with a teaser for you of some of the members of the Philadelphia Area Consortium of Special Collections Libraries. I interviewed them on Archive Night, just quickly explaining what they have and what might be of interest to genealogists. And then we're going to get to our guest this week.
So my name is Jesse Brody, and I work in the Drexel University Archives. What we have are materials that document the history of the university as well as the Drexel family. And what we can usually offer for people doing genealogical research is if their relative graduated from Drexel, we can provide that confirmation, and usually a yearbook photo. Depending on the yearbook, we may also be able to provide information on the activities their ancestor was involved with. But unfortunately, unless someone was very involved in student government or some other student activity, or very involved as an alum later on in life, we usually don't have much more information than that. So it's usually just kind of information from yearbooks.
And if a genealogist wanted to contact you, what's the best way to get in contact with the archives?
So the best way is to email us at archives@drexel.edu, and we'll get back to you pretty promptly to figure out, how to help you best.
Thank you.
Yeah.
My name is Joshua Blaine. I'm the Registrar and Collections Manager for the City Archives for the City of Philadelphia. Officially from the Department of Records, but the City Archives is a unit of the Department of Records.
And the Archives for Philadelphia has a great description on their website of the kinds of records that you have. You mentioned it's a little bit out of date, but the basic structure's there.
Yeah, the basic structure's there, as well as our whole digital finding guide. Obviously, we have a lot more information on site, but the city agency list is broken down to different departments, and it'll give you a basic overview. Some of it's a little more detailed than others, but a very basic overview of what we have there. And from there, we can certainly help you more on site for people who are able to come on site. And we also answer a lot of off-site research requests, people both in the area and also around the world as well. Yep.
Excellent. So the one piece of information I think most genealogists are interested in is a will for their ancestor or a probate record. And I did notice that those indexes are at City Hall, and we request them at City Hall, correct?
Yes, that is correct. The Register of Wills has storage space on location where we're located, but you still have to go through their main office. Register of Wills and probate records is one of the very few official city documents we do not have in the archives. That's considered part of their originating office still, so you have to go through the Register of Wills for that information. Yep.
And I was at the archives. The staff is incredibly friendly and helpful.
Thank you.
And the space is very pleasant. It has bright light, like big tables. It's very easy. You can hang out there and not feel that you're in anyone's way, unlike some courthouses.
Yeah, not at all. We're at our new facility, which we reopened to the public after our move over from Market Street. We reopened a year ago this past Labor Day weekend. We're back to 5 days a week. We were at 3 days a week at the other location, but we're back to 5 days a week. Open Monday through Friday, 9 to 4:30, closed major holidays. And the best part is at the new facility as well is the great open spaces, and it's also new exhibit space. We have free off-street parking available at the Target lot. We all share the same building with Target and Yards Brewing Company, but we all have our separate entrances, of course. But people can park for free at the Target lot. There is 2-hour parking on Spring Garden Street, but people can feel free to park at the Target lot. It's the same building. It's just about a half block down from our front door, which is located at 6th and Spring Garden.
Excellent.
Yep, you're welcome.
Hi, I'm Caitlin Goodman. I'm the curator of the Rare Book Department at the Free Library of Philadelphia. The rare book department actually is a collection of collections with real strengths in book arts and history of the book. And so we don't have much local Philadelphia history. But elsewhere in the Free Library, there's a ton of genealogical resources, especially in the map collection. Their old insurance map track houses historically through Philadelphia's centuries, and you can really be able to trace back your family lineage that way. If you go to the website, freelibrary.org, in the middle bar, the green tab, there is a clicker for genealogical resources, and it'll point you to a variety of databases, books, and departments in the Free Library that can help you with your work.
So my name is Patrick Shank, and I'm the archivist for the Archdiocese. So some of the stuff we have for genealogists, everything before 1919 has been digitized, available on Find My Past, which is keyword searchable, which is great because before it was all parish-based records, so if you didn't know the parish, you couldn't find it. They also made all the records free on the Catholic Heritage Archive, which isn't keyword searchable, but if you know the parish, you can find the record that way. We also still offer in-house genealogy searches, so people can request for us to do the search. We can go through all the microfilm, find it up until 1941. We also have a few school records for a couple different parishes, and some orphanage records too that we could search through for genealogy.
So in the Philadelphia area, a lot of parishes have consolidated or shut down, and would you be able to help people with that to figure out where, if they wanted to find like burial records or something, or where their ancestor was buried, through, can you help with that?
Sure. So the first part, when the parishes consolidate, all records get sent to one other parish. And we do have some early maps of the diocese, so we can see where they lived, that would say what parish they used to be in, and direct them that way. For burial records, we don't have any at our archives. All the diocesan ones, so like Old Cathedral, New Cathedral, Holy Sepulchre, they're all managed by a company called Stonemore, and they have all the records there, and they can reach out and they should be able to find them. Parish cemeteries, they are still managed by the parish. So like St. John the Baptist and Manioc, they still have all their the parish cemetery records. So we would help them direct out to those parishes to find them. The only ones we have, I think, are the old St. Mary's, back like from the 1700s, are the ones we have.
Were there any Catholic traveling ministers or priests, that traveled around? Do you have records for those, like the early 1700s, 1800s?
Yes. So we have typed transcripts of all those, so we can search those as well. And those for most of like Northeast Pennsylvania, I believe maybe a bit of like the now Pittsburgh diocese area, but I'm not positive on that. But yeah, for like definitely the Northeast, we have those records.
And one last question. So the Philadelphia area includes, the Scandin records includes Montgomery, Chester, Bucks counties, as well as Philadelphia and Delaware. And so if you're outside of that area researching somewhere else in Pennsylvania, they should contact the local parishes there?
Yeah, so they can either contact that local parish from the other diocese or the diocese directly. So I know we often send people to Scranton and Allentown because they have their own archives, which can help them a bit better than what we can, knowing where the parish is, if it's still operating, and that kind of stuff.
Thank you very much.
Of course, my pleasure.
Hi, I'm Kathy Haas. I'm the Director of Historical Resources at Girard College, which includes both the museum and archival collections. Girard College was a school originally established for poor white male orphans in Philadelphia, accepted students from Philadelphia and Pennsylvania throughout most of its history, and then broadened in the 20th century. We are still an active school. We are now multiracial and coeducational, but we have our student records going all the way back to when we opened in 1848, so I spent a lot of time fielding genealogical requests from people whose ancestors attended Girard College. Because of the nature of the school, which required that the father be dead and also required that the mother not have financial means, that the school required a lot of information on the application, so they tend to be a pretty rich source of information for genealogists because we have information about the parents, usually when they married, information about how the father died, information about the financial situation of the family, sometimes information about grandparents, siblings, other things like that get recorded. We usually have information about from the application of the student to the school, and then his discharge at the end, where he was, where he went after he either graduated or finished. We sometimes have information about the time that the student spent at the school. That varies a lot from student to student and also depends how far back you go. Obviously, when you go back to the 1850s, we don't have a lot of things like report cards, but you start to get more of that when you get into the 20th century.
Wow. I would just fall over for information in the 1850s, on detailed information. That's absolutely incredible. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So you're probably asking yourself, how would I even know of these places and what they had in their collection? I don't live in Philadelphia. I didn't grow up there. How would I ever find out? And that is where the great work of PACSCL comes into play for genealogists all over the world. Holly Mengel is our guest this week, and she is representing PACSCL as one of the members of the association, and will talk to you about everything that they could possibly offer for genealogists. Without further waiting for you, because I know you're anxious to get to it, here is Holly. Holly, I wanted to welcome you to the podcast. Holly, you work at the Kissick Center for Special Collections and Rare Books and Manuscripts at Penn, I should say the University of Pennsylvania, which is in Philadelphia. And then today, Holly, you're going to talk to us, though, on behalf of what I think of in my world, the greatest collection of archives ever to exist in the Philadelphia area. I mean, I just love this group. So it's the Philadelphia Area Consortium of Special Collections and Libraries. And Holly, I just thank you for coming on the podcast. I've been so looking forward to this interview because, as I said, PACSCL is the greatest collection of archives in the entire world. It's a very brag statement, but I just love everything about this consortium and what you guys are up to, and what it is you're trying to do and what you're preserving for all of us in genealogy and just every researcher everywhere. So if you can say a little bit about yourself and sort of your role as an archivist, I'd really love that so people can understand a little bit about who you are and the work that you do.
Sure. I'm also a huge fan of PACSCL, so I'm perfectly happy to talk about how great they are. As Denise mentioned, I'm an archivist. I'm currently at the Kissick Center for Special Collections, Rare Books, and Manuscripts at Penn. But over the last 20-ish years, I've worked at repositories across the state, from Pittsburgh to Harrisburg to Philadelphia, where I was first involved with PACSCL's Hidden Collections Grant from 2009 to 2012. Then I went very briefly to Princeton before I came back to Penn, and that's where I've been for the past 6 years. And as an archivist, for the most part, I'm a processing archivist, which is, in my opinion, the most fun archivist. So I get to take newly acquired collections, I get to process them, arrange them, describe them, and make them available to researchers. And that's what I've done pretty much for my entire career. And so the end product of what I make is a finding aid, and that is what I'm going to talk to you today about. The finding aid site, which is hosted by PACSCL and Penn, and what you can do with them, and what our greater sites can do to help you with your research.
You and I had coffee, and we talked about what is it that genealogists would love to know about, and we decided that these finding aids, and particularly the ones created by PACSCL, is exactly the tool, exactly the thing to talk about. Because you could honestly spend 3 weeks talking about everything in every collection, right?
Yeah, happily.
You and I could just keep talking. But let's give people tools, right? So,
yep.
Let's talk about the finding aids.
Okay. So a finding aid is really simply a tool to help you navigate what might be a large and unwieldy archival collection. So just so you know, over the years, this sort of tool has had lots of different names. It's been called a register, a calendar, a guide, an index, and an inventory. But for the most part, these days, people are going to refer to it as a finding aid. And it's really just a big outline that's made up of two components. The first part is information about the collection, and the second part is the container list. And the information about the collection ideally should provide you with all the information you need to know about the collection generally. So you should find out where the collection physically lives, who created the collection, the date ranges covered in the collection, how big it is, which is important because you want to know how long you need to spend when you're researching, who or what the collection is about, and that's found in the biographical or historical note, and then what sort of stuff is in the collection, and that's found in the scope and contents note. The other thing that's super helpful is that lots of archival collections will have related archival collections. So basically what that is the archivist has done some of your work for you. They're going to tell you, okay, this family is in this collection, but they're also in these other 5 collections, for just as an example. And then the other thing that's really important is they're going to tell you if there's any restrictions against use, and that you want to know also before you go and spend time at a repository. And then the container list is going to tell you in greater detail than the scope and content note what's actually in the collection. So that will be like what's in each box and folder number, or what's in each box, depending on how detailed the finding aid is. And that's where you would probably find, specific types of material related to family members.
Right. So when you talk about the size of the collection, that's in linear feet, correct?
Correct. Yeah. So,
Okay.
So we measure how much material there is in linear feet, and so it's nice because I think that's something that's very easy to visualize. But you can have collections that are half a linear foot, and you can have collections that are 150 to 180 linear feet, or as much as 500 linear feet. And then we also would tell you how many boxes ideally, but you're going to be concerned about how many linear feet. If you have half a linear foot, that's maybe an afternoon, but 500, you're going to have to spend a lot more time with the finding aid because you'll want to limit yourself to a much, much smaller component of that collection.
Right. It's literally like the ruler foot. It's not any fancy,
Correct. Yep. Nope. It's it's how much material you have there, and all it does really is give you a sense of how big it is and how much information is actually there.
Okay. And when you talk about too on the finding aid that the collection listing, maybe let's say it's the collection all related to one family, and then the family collected letters or from different people, let's say, is part of the collection. It's not going to list every person in every single letter. It might just list the recipient. So if they were in correspondence with one particular other individual, and they're writing back and forth, but very rarely will it list everybody associated in that letter.
Right, that's absolutely correct, because as you and I chatted about, but I think is really important for people to understand, is that the way that archivists process collections has really changed over the years. And in the early days of the archival profession, a lot of description took place at great detail. So like the WPA, for example, did amazingly detailed descriptions of some really awesome early American collections. But as time went on and collections increased in size because of affordability of paper, literacy, just general output, archivists trying to do this sort of detailed work were simply unable to keep up. And then as a result, archival repositories across the country accumulated what was known in the profession as backlog. And that just means that there's material that is unprocessed and therefore completely unavailable to researchers and genealogists. So during the last 10 to 15 years, there's been an enormous effort to make more material accessible to researchers more quickly, and that's pretty much across the country that archival repositories will do less intensive description. But what that means is it's harder work for genealogists because we won't necessarily list every person. Instead, we might just say, here's a folder or 10 folders of material related to a family rather than an individual's name. So it's sort of more, you have to be more of a detective and be more intuitive about where things might be, and you might spend more time. And archivists know that this is an unfortunate compromise, but we think it's necessary because otherwise researchers have no access to material and it's completely hidden.
Yeah, I think it is a great compromise. For us as genealogists, a lot of us are kind of used to that in terms of a lot of volunteer work went into, like, say, indexing wills at courthouses.
Mm-hmm.
So people didn't have to use the clerk's index at the courthouse. They could use these typed up indexes, and people would just list the deceased and the date sometimes, and they wouldn't list every other name in the will and who
Right.
the inheritors were, or sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. So we know that we need to go back to those original documents and pull them, or at least we know we're supposed to, not,
Right.
and not just go with what's in the index. But talk more about being a detective, because I think that's a great word and a great way to
Okay.
look at it. Because this is a little Sherlock Holmesy, in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple different ways that are, the sort of the super easy part is like figuring out some of the basics. Like if your family member went to a college, then you want to contact that college archives. If your family belonged to a church, synagogue, mosque, or a Quaker meeting, visit the religious institution's archives. They always kept really great records. And if you know what town your family member lived in, you should go to a local historical society or the county or state archives. But those are the easy ones. I think what's harder is figuring out the relationships between the people and discovering organizations to which that person belonged or were involved in. So, you might find that collections that are, if you had a scientist in your family, then they might have donated their papers to the Academy of Natural Sciences of Philadelphia. But if your family member was a physician, they may have given their papers to the College of Physicians of Philadelphia. And if you're women, who are always the really tricky ones to find, what was their spouse involved in? If they were a professor at Haverford, their joint papers might be at Haverford. But women are almost always the really, really tricky ones to find. And then what I think becomes even more interesting is when you find out who their friends are and who they might. So then you might end up with an entirely different family collection that you're going to have these records with. I'm going to just use one really quick example that is from a real collection, and it works well in Philly because it's the Biddle families.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have at Penn, we have a collection which has 4 generations of one branch of Philadelphia Biddles. The way that the finding aid can be really helpful is you can sort of narrow your searching. So let's just say you are interested in Edith Biddle, and she was alive from 1881 to 1938. So if you look at a finding aid and the collection only is from 1800 to 1835, you can say, I don't need to look at that collection because she wasn't even alive then. And if you know that she kept a diary and you're hoping to find that, but the collection says it only has correspondence, then maybe you don't want to spend your time on that. So you can use it to narrow your search. But it's not going to do all your work for you. You're still going to have to realize that there's going to be lots of things where you look at a finding aid and you say, ooh, that might have stuff, but it doesn't actually have stuff. If I talk about continue to talk about this Biddle family, going backwards, even if Edith isn't in a collection, the ancestors are. So Edith's great-great-grandfather was Clement Biddle, who served in the Revolutionary War, and his brother was Nicholas Biddle, who was the famous financier and banker. So both of them have a few papers in Penn's collection, but they have at least 5 or 6 collections in Philly at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, at Swarthmore, and at the University of Delaware. And references to Nicholas Biddle can be found in more than 150 online finding aids, including the Library of Congress. So you can sort of go out in this huge, search that is just makes this crazy web of people. So Edith, if we go back to her, she was in World War I, and her brother was one of the first Americans to die in World War One. So there's a World War One collection about him at Historical Society of Pennsylvania, which includes letters from her. So even though that collection isn't about her, that collection is going to have stuff from her. And she was apparently involved in the Octavia Hill Association, which was about housing, and that's a temple. So, you have to really sort of figure out who she is, who her family is, how they were connected to each other, and what sort of things they were involved with. So she died quite early at 57, so there was a huge outpouring of sympathy sent to her family. And those are all in the Penn collection. But every one of them has a person's name who's a friend or a family member, so you could go and look at all of their papers in order to find more about her. And that doesn't even include all the prominent Pennsylvania families that the Biddles married into. So those who are familiar with famous Philadelphia or early American families will recognize the names Barclay, Blair, Cadwallader, Cox, Lyman, Rush, and Williams, just to name a few. And all of those have archival collections that are around the city and the country. So it's just like a big, huge puzzle. And the more pieces you find, the more of a picture you get. So
I am laughing along as you're describing this, because it's like, it really is that story of be careful of the question that you ask.
Right,
you really
right.
gotta hone in on what is it you want to know about Edith, and
right.
And if you want to know
really
everything,
yeah, it's easy to go down a rabbit hole and just never quite come out, which is so fun.
Right.
So that brings me to the Finding Aid site, Philadelphia Area Archives Research Portal, which is awesome because it brings together more than 200 regional institutions' finding aids into one system and allows you to do keyword searching across all of the finding aids in the site. So to go back to Edith, if she's mentioned in any part of any finding aid in the more than 5,000 collections, you're going to get a hit. And even though it's sort of focused on the Philadelphia area, it's not just Philadelphia. There's lots and lots of wider geographic areas covered. So it's a great place to sort of start your research. The other thing that you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation about really doing your research is understanding what sort of institutions have strengths. So if your family member was a woman physician or a homeopathic physician, the Drexel College of Medicine's Legacy Center focuses on both of those types of physicians. The Library Company and the Historical Society of Pennsylvania and Chester County Historical Society, for example, have really good collections dealing with colonial and early American families. But if you want Quakers, you can go to Swarthmore and Haverford, which have great Quaker materials. And Temple has materials that relate to sort of like Philadelphia urban organizations. And these are just examples, and those repositories have way more than those things, but those are sort of very concentrated, strengths that each one of those have.
Can you talk a little bit too? We had talked about this, but why something like, to go back to Edith Biddle, why is her stuff all over the place, right? So there's a good reason for it, right? But it can be frustrating to a first-time researcher. Like, well, why is it like this?
Absolutely. So one of the key tenets of the archival profession is really that you keep things together by the creator of the collection. So we can say that if Edith Biddle has her own papers, which as far as I know she doesn't, but if she did, they would be kept together, even if there is a Biddle family papers in the same exact repository. And everything that Edith sent to a person will be in that person's collection. So let's just say that Edith and Mary Smith were best friends. If Edith sent material to Mary Smith, everything that was in Mary Smith's possession are in the Mary Smith papers. And so that means that things do get completely spread all over everything. And to go back to like the example of having one brother having papers at the Academy of Natural Sciences and one brother having material at the College of Physicians, if they were members of, the Anthropological Society of America, the Anthropological Society of America has its own records, and everything he did with that organization would be kept in their records. And then we talk about, people moving, and all of a sudden you have Aunt Jane who moved to California, and her papers are in a California Historical Society. So you end up with material very naturally going in lots of different directions. It makes sense when you think about who sort of had the papers at the time of death, is how I try to think about how that works. So if, everything that got sent to me would be mine, even if those include famous people from, people who have collections elsewhere. So it ends up sort of being dispersed all across the city, the state, the country, internationally. It just depends on, what your family member was involved in. So it's a very puzzling and exciting game, so to speak.
Exactly. Yes, and I think that's a great way to look at it. It's a game. It's a scavenger hunt a little bit, and it's also a way to retrace your ancestor steps. It's an opportunity to do that a little bit, and who they were associating with, as you said, what groups they were involved with, who their social circle was, is all going to provide you clues as to where to find anything about them. And just to emphasize, the PACSCL's archives and libraries, their collections, are all pretty much the non-governmental records, right? So you're not going to generally find in here birth certificates, death certificates, wills, like all the stuff that the government requires us to do as part of our life. These are manuscripts, diaries, journals, letters, photos sometimes, right? Like it's
absolutely, yeah,
okay.
All kinds of stuff. And but you're absolutely right. It's generally not the government material. Those are by law required to be kept. So what you might find is copies of those things in the collections, but you're not going to find the originals for the most part. The other thing that you might find is, business records. Like the Hagley has an amazing business records. So if you know that your, grandfather worked for an organization or for a company for their entire career, there's probably going to be employee records in there that you would be able to find. You just really have to sort of look around and find out what kind of things are out there.
Yes. Okay, good. I'm glad you clarified that. I think we talked about finding aids and being a detective and why materials dispersed. Anything else you want to say about that? And do you say PARP or as the?
We do call it PARP, but yeah.
Okay, the PARP as the. Anything else about the PARP finding aid or website?
Yeah, actually, I think it's as important to know, it's a great resource and it's a great place to start, but it's also really important to know that even though there's more than 5,000 archival collections described on PARP, there's lots more that aren't available through the site. In order for them to be on the site, they need to be, first of all, electronic, and they also need to be encoded in archival description, which is not something that lots of people do. So even those that are electronic, if they're in old formats that don't work within the PARP system, they're not going to be there. So it's really worthwhile to contact an archive that has connections to your family members, even if you can't find any trace of them online. So it's a great place to start, but it is not all of the material in Philadelphia by any means. That's going to be across the world. There will never be a case where every finding aid is available electronically.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that too, because a lot of genealogists are trained to look at archive grid, and it's the same with archive grid, right? Like
Correct.
it's not.
Yeah. Yeah, and in that case, it's generally MARC records are pulled out of OCLC. So your library has to be a member of OCLC in order for that to have your finding aids pulled into Archive Grid. So it's always going to just be a small fraction of what's actually out there.
So the best thing to do then as a genealogist is to put on your detective hat and gear and retrace your ancestors' steps and really look to see what archives are around where they lived, died, and were born, and maybe where their children, if they pass things down to their children, where their children might have lived and died, and because all those places could have manuscript collections, right, on that person.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right.
Right.
And to look at the famous people, maybe that they lived around, and they could have written something about if your ancestor was doing a profession that might have brought them into the other person's purview.
Right. There's also some really easy ways to sort of narrow your searching that I thought might be useful if you're interested.
Oh yeah, no, please.
So one of the really easy things to do is to so archival collections are the profession has sort of a standard way of naming collections, and that would be like the John Smith papers or the Thomas A. Biddle and Company records, for example. So when you're searching, if you put that phrase in quotes, like so the Edith Biddle papers in quotes, or the Biddle family papers in quotes, or the Thomas A. Biddle and Company records, you're going to get archival collections that come out of there, instead of just searching for Edith Biddle, where you'll get every mention of Edith Biddle. And even if those collections aren't necessarily online, if the repository mentions them somewhere, it should still come up.
Okay, and this is in the Google search box, right?
This is just in a Google search box.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But it's a good way to sort of start, and find out whether or not you have a collection, or if you're just finding, the Edith Biddle who is a lawyer today.
Right.
You don't necessarily want her. So the other thing that's really important is that for genealogists, you need to remember that you probably aren't the first genealogist for this family ever. And a lot of collections actually contain huge amounts of work that's been done. So once you get to a finding aid, you should do a search within the finding aid for things like genealogy, family history, obituaries, company histories, biographies, or family Bibles. And you could find that a ton of your work has been done for you, which is really nice. So this Biddle family collection has a whole series where the person who donated it had been doing family research for years and years and years, and all of his research was in that collection, which meant that people had a huge step up as far as finding out where people were, which is amazing.
Yes, and thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, the Genealogy Society of Pennsylvania, a lot of their genealogists' research is at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. So, yeah, you can totally pull up the papers of someone who might have worked on that family in 1970, let's say, and looked up all the wills and deeds and done some notes and some, sketches out and everything, and written letters, and it's interesting.
I just opened a Bible the other day that had tons of little pieces of paper slipped in there, and it had, probably a dozen obituaries that they had sort of tucked in, and it had the birth and death dates and the family record period. But it's the kind of thing that you might not necessarily think that that's where you're going to find that information, but it actually is there.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah. You love that when you run across like the family historian, the previous one.
Exactly.
Collected a bunch of
It makes
things.
my job easy when they do that.
Well, I told you the story of coming across that letter where the woman wrote she was looking for her biological parents. They had died when she was 8, and she wrote out her whole family history, like her 2 sisters' names, who they were married to, where she was born, what her parents' names were, because she remembered them, she was 8, who her godparents were, who she went to live with, It's like,
and all of those could turn into archival collections, but then you can search for more info. So it's great.
it's just wonderful. It's like
Yeah.
every time a woman writes a letter or keeps a diary, I'm so thankful, because a lot of
Right.
times, as you mentioned, they're attached to their husbands if they were married, but otherwise they tend to, disappear in history, and we unless they say something, we don't always know about their life.
Right.
And then her having just two sisters, it's like, oh, then they really don't track because they, took their husband's names and everything.
Right.
Anyway, so it was, I'm in love with this woman and I don't even know her. I was just like, thank you for writing this letter, and thank you, HSP, for preserving it in a folder and I could find it, I was so excited. So, I think you wanted to talk about too, like why going to an archive is awesome. I mean, I know it's awesome, but and you get to work in one every day. So like,
I know, it's the best job ever. Well, so you had mentioned that lots of researchers today just rely on material that's been digitized and is online. But I think that what's really important for researchers to know is that the amount of digitized material is minuscule compared to the amount of material that actually exists. So it is really worth it to go visit an archives and look through the collection in person. And one of the things that I love about archival collections is that they're really all about context. And as we've sort of been talking about all today, the deeper you look, the more you're going to find. And even if you don't find the thing that you thought you were going to be looking for, you might still find 10 things that you didn't even imagine existed. And the other reason I think is really good is to make friends with the archivist, because material gets acquired and processed all the time. And archivists, generally speaking, have long and good memories. So when new stuff becomes available, they might actually contact you, or they might even just say, oh, the best place for you to look is here, and it's just not a place that you would have thought of. But the archival community is really quite close-knit, and we do, generally speaking, love to help researchers find what they're looking for.
Yeah, I think you guys get
and
just
it's
as
fun.
It's fun. I was going to say, I think you as a community get just as excited as we do, as the researcher coming in, because, no archivist has read through the entirety of their collection in every box. So sometimes, when a researcher comes in and pulls, some special collection for someone and finds something, it could be the first time that they've seen it too, and are like, oh, I didn't know we had that. Or they knew that you had it.
We learn from researchers all the time, and then can use that information in different ways.
Yeah,
so it's definitely, it's great. Absolutely.
Yeah, there's an institutional knowledge that the people have that it can't be replaced by a computer at all, right? I mean, as much as we would love computers to do our thing, the context is so important, and I think you reminded people of that in your example with Edith Slice. So thank you for that.
Sure.
Yeah, because even if you typed into a search box in Archive Grid or PAARP about Edith Biddle, you might still not understand the context in which her collection was created and left in the different places, preserved there. Right. So, and you still need to go and look to understand it. Was there anything else that you wanted to say or cover about the work of PACSCL and the PAARP finding aid?
Clearly, PACSCL is a great organization that really is, I always think of it as sort of taking all of the bits and putting them into a big bowl so that you actually have a sense of, again, it really is all about context and how the resources are shared and how people can use more than one collection in order to find like the deeper story. So one of the things that I love about archives is that, when you think about any story, if you and I look back on this conversation, we're going to remember it just a little bit differently. So in order to take both of our points of view, or whatever topic, say World War I, where you have, the Allied, the Axis, or not the Axis in World War I, but all the different points of view. When you put them together, only then do you actually get the full story. Until you have every perspective, you only have one point of view. And that point of view is true, but only for some people. And so what I love about archives and what I love about PARP is that it gives you the opportunity to look at any topic or any person from multiple points of view and gives you the opportunity to find the real story. So for me, that is what I love most about archives, and what I think PARP does beautifully is to bring all of the potential stories into one so that you can actually see a much fuller perspective of what a historical event or a person or anything is actually what it really was. And that's what I love about archives.
Yeah, that's
But
perfect.
I really love archives, so.
I do too. I do too. I love what you just said, because it does cover it. When you grow up and you go to, you take history class because it's required, and you just sort of get this one version of history because that's all they have time to teach you. And when you do your own research, you're like, oh, there's a lot more to discover here than just what I was told. There's always like another layer, another perspective, and it's wonderful. Yeah. And archives, you get it straight from the source too.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So great. My favorite part about archives and archivists is you all are lovingly preserving all this material for us and organizing it and keeping it in the best condition possible, just waiting for somebody to come in and look at it, right? Like, you have no idea, like it's all equally preserved. It's not, you have no idea what's going to be you don't pick a favorite, like the most important collection out of it gets better treatment,
and we don't
right?
know how the collection will get used, because lots of collections can be used in lots of different ways,
right?
Which is great.
Yeah, that's what I love about it. You're just equal opportunity preservers. You do not hold one is more important than another, or more valuable. Right. And you're equally excited no matter what we're researching to help us and be of assistance. So it's really wonderful. I do have to tell people too that PACSCL is 40 different collections and archives in the Philadelphia area. It does reach into Delaware, right, in New Jersey, and into the center of Pennsylvania. But I'll detail out a list for folks in post-production and put it in the show notes. But I encourage people to just really spend some time learning about each of those libraries and collections, what kinds of things they have in there. Really spend some time going through the finding aid on PARP to understand what's available. And the PARP finding aid has some wonderful history for some of the collections, so you can really get an education about Philadelphia area history and the groups and the ethnicities and the cast of characters that we've had here over the years through those collections. Was there anything else that you wanted to jump in there with?
No, I think that's great.
Okay. Holly, thank you so much for being on the podcast and taking the time. I really hope people come and take the time to visit the different archives that we have and check out what PARP and PACSCL have.
Thank you so much.
I want to thank Holly once again for really taking the time to dig in deep with us on how to use finding aids and structure our research so we know which archive and which collection would best help us. Next week is the final episode for Your Pennsylvania Ancestors for Season 1, and it's a special Q&A episode. I have a bunch of questions that came in, and if you want to get your question answered, head over to my website, PAAncestors.com. Click on the blue button there that says Leave a Question. You can record up to 5 minutes with what your question is, and I'll use the recording next week on the show and answer it. Thanks for listening.